Lucy Hartfield had always been a source of trouble at the local grocery store. For months, her conduct had been a point of contention among her colleagues, and many employees had quietly discussed how difficult she was to work with. Lucy had a way of making people feel uncomfortable, especially those who didn't look like her. From the moment they walked into the store, she seemed to single them out with her sharp remarks and disdainful stares. She never hesitated to make her feelings clear, especially toward customers who were different from her. Her harsh attitude wasn't reserved for just customers. Lucy had a tendency to create tension among her coworkers as well. She often made offhand comments that suggested certain employees didn't belong in the store, particularly people of color. Over time, the atmosphere at the store became toxic, and even those who weren't directly affected by Lucy's behavior could feel the weight of her negativity. People started whispering about her, how she made others feel small and unwelcome, how her presence was a constant reminder of what prejudice and bias looked like. Despite the numerous complaints that had been filed against Lucy, the management seemed unwilling to take significant action. The store was understaffed, and Lucy had been there long enough to be seen as indispensable, at least in the eyes of the higher-ups. Each time an incident occurred, Lucy would offer a half-hearted apology, promising to do better, only to repeat her offensive behavior in the next week. It was a frustrating cycle, and many employees had simply learned to keep their heads down whenever she was around. Rob Markins, the owner and CEO of the grocery chain, had heard murmurs about the ongoing issues at the store, but he'd never paid much attention to them. He was a hands-on leader, preferring to visit his stores and experience the environment firsthand rather than relying on second-hand reports. As a result, he decided to drop by the store on a random morning, blending in with the crowd and observing what was really going on. Rob was no stranger to the day-to-day operations of his business, but this time he decided to take an incognito approach, opting for casual clothes to avoid any recognition. He wanted to see the store through the eyes of the customers. He walked through the aisles, taking note of the inventory, the cleanliness, and the overall ambience. The store was quiet enough that Rob was able to appreciate the organization of the shelves and the variety of products available. Everything seemed to be in order, until he made his way toward the checkout line. As he approached the register, Rob could see Lucy standing behind it, scanning a few items for a customer. She wore the same scowl she always did, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Rob had no idea what kind of person Lucy was outside of the brief interactions he had heard about. But as he stood in line, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the way she carried herself. There was a quiet sense of arrogance in her posture, like she believed she was above everyone around her. It was this attitude, Rob quickly realized, that would ultimately set the stage for the confrontation that would unfold just moments later. Rob took his time browsing the aisles, making mental notes of the items he would need at home. He wasn't in a rush, he simply wanted to observe, to get a feel for the environment in one of his stores. As he walked past the produce section, he picked out fresh vegetables and fruits, making sure to select only the best. He glanced at the deli counter, admiring the neat arrangement of meats and cheeses. Rob's mind wandered as he thought about how he could improve the store's layout, how to better serve customers, and how to make the shopping experience more enjoyable for everyone. The store had always been a point of pride for Rob, he had built it from the ground up, and he cared deeply about the way it ran. But as he turned the corner and saw Lucy manning the register, a sense of unease washed over him. It wasn't just her cold demeanor that made him feel uncomfortable, it was the way she held herself, the arrogance she seemed to exude as she scanned each item with a casual disregard for the people she was serving. Rob lined up behind a couple with a cart full of groceries. He waited patiently, hoping the transaction would move quickly. The couple paid and left, and soon Rob found himself standing at the register, just a few feet away from Lucy. His heart rate stayed steady. After all, he wasn't there as a customer, but as an observer. As he placed his items on the counter, he couldn't help but notice how Lucy's eyes narrowed as she looked him over. Lucy seemed to take an immediate disliking to Rob. He wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did he look like he had money to burn. His casual appearance didn't help him fit the image of someone who would typically shop at her store. It was a look she had come to associate with people she deemed unworthy or out of place. As Rob placed his groceries on the counter, Lucy's gaze fell upon him, and her lips tightened into a thin, judgmental line. She scanned the items slowly, almost deliberately, her eyes scanning the price tags as if she were judging him for every dollar he spent. Then, without warning, she spoke in a cold, dismissive tone. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "I don't think you can afford this. You should leave." Rob's brows furrowed in surprise. He had dealt with plenty of difficult customers and employees in his time, but he had never been treated like this in his own store. It wasn't just that Lucy had judged him, it was the audacity of it all. Her words were sharp, her tone authoritative, as if she had the power to decide who belonged in the store and who didn't. "Excuse me?" Rob asked, trying to maintain his composure. "What do you mean I'm not supposed to be here?" Lucy's gaze remained unyielding. "You heard me. People like you don't belong in places like this. You should leave." The words stung more than Rob expected, but instead of reacting with anger, he took a deep breath. He knew that people like Lucy had a tendency to project their insecurities and biases onto others, but this was something more, something deeper. It was a moment that called for more than just a confrontation. It called for a reckoning. Rob stood there, stunned for a moment, unable to process what Lucy had just said. The audacity of her words sent a jolt of anger through him, but he fought to remain composed. He wasn't about to let this encounter spiral into something more volatile. His chest tightened, and his hand instinctively curled into a fist, but he took a slow, steady breath. This wasn't the time for confrontation, it was a moment for clarity. "Excuse me?" Rob asked, trying to mask the surprise in his voice. "What do you mean?" Lucy's eyes gleamed with an almost unsettling certainty. Her arms were folded across her chest as she looked down at Rob, her stance rigid and dismissive. "You heard me," she said again, each word cold and sharp. "People like you don't belong here. You shouldn't be shopping at this store. I'm not letting you purchase any of this." Rob could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. The sheer audacity of her words stung, not just because she had targeted him, but because it was a reflection of how she treated others on a daily basis. The sharpness in her voice, the complete disregard for respect, it wasn't just directed at him, it was a manifestation of everything wrong with her attitude. He could feel the gaze of other customers turning toward them, the awkward tension building in the air. For a split second, Rob considered walking away. He could leave and report her actions to the management later. But something inside him told him this moment couldn't go by unnoticed. He wasn't just a customer in this store. He wasn't just a person who could simply be dismissed. "No," he said, his voice unwavering. "I won't leave." Lucy looked at him, eyebrows furrowed in confusion, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would stand their ground against her. She'd likely never had anyone challenge her authority, let alone question her sense of superiority. "I'm telling you to leave," she insisted, her voice growing louder now. A few people in the store glanced nervously between them, but most of them were too stunned to intervene. Rob, still keeping his composure, took a small step forward, maintaining eye contact with Lucy. The space between them now felt charged, thick with the weight of what was unfolding. "You know, I'm actually the CEO of this company," Rob said, his tone measured but firm. He could feel the shift in the air as his words landed. Lucy's eyes widened in disbelief. She had likely assumed him to be just another customer, someone who didn't belong, in her eyes. "This is my store," he continued, his voice slightly louder now, ensuring everyone around them could hear. "And your behavior today is completely unacceptable." For a moment, Lucy stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as she processed the revelation. Her eyes darted between Rob and the checkout screen, almost as if she was trying to figure out if he was joking, if this was some sort of elaborate prank. But there was no mistaking the sincerity in Rob's eyes. His words hit her like a brick, shattering the false sense of control she had clung to. You're the CEO. Lucy stammered, her voice faltering for the first time since the exchange began. Rob nodded slowly, his gaze steady. Yes. I am. The customers around them, previously silent, began to murmur in hushed tones, the realization sinking in for them too. Rob could feel the eyes of the room on him, some filled with disbelief, others with curiosity, as if they too were waiting for the fallout. He didn't let the moment linger in silence for too long. You should never judge anyone based on their appearance or make assumptions about them, Rob said, his voice firm but calm. Your actions today were unacceptable. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a reprimand all in one. Lucy's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and realization sweeping over her. She had always thought she was in control of situations like this, her judgmental behavior, her prejudices. She had always assumed that no one would question her authority. But now, faced with the man who held the keys to the company, she was suddenly aware of just how small her position really was. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to say, what to do next. But nothing came to her. There were no excuses, no defense she could offer that would make this situation right. She had gone too far, and the consequences were already beginning to unfold. As the weight of Rob's words settled in, the arrogance that had defined her behavior for so long evaporated, leaving behind only regret and humiliation. Rob stood tall, unwavering, as the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. It was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a moment of reckoning, not just for Lucy, but for everyone who had witnessed her toxic behavior. And in that silence, Lucy realized that she had lost more than just her temper, she had lost her place in this store, and potentially, her future. The shock of Rob's revelation hit Lucy like a ton of bricks. Her face paled, the blood draining from her cheeks as the weight of what she had just done hit her all at once. For a split second, she couldn't form any words. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but the pieces didn't fit. She had assumed she could treat people any way she wanted, that no one would challenge her, that her prejudices would go unchecked. But now, standing before the very person who owned the store, all of her beliefs came crashing down around her. Wait, no. That can't be, Lucy mumbled, her voice trembling. She looked around as if hoping someone else would intervene, as if someone would tell her this was all a misunderstanding. But there was no one to save her now. No one to stop the consequences of her actions from unfolding. The store had become a silent witness to her downfall, and there was no way out. Her face flushed with a deep shade of crimson as the realization began to sink in. The man she had just humiliated, the person she had told to leave, was the very person who owned everything she worked for. Rob Markins wasn't just another customer, he was her boss, the person who signed her paycheck, the one who had the power to make decisions that affected her life. And in this moment, Lucy understood exactly how badly she had miscalculated. Her mouth went dry, and her thoughts spun in circles. She had tried to write off her behavior as harmless, as something that no one would notice. But now, the consequences were right in front of her, glaring and undeniable. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Wait, no. I didn't mean. I was just, Lucy stuttered, her words faltering as she attempted to explain herself. But nothing she said would change what had just happened. The damage was already done, and she couldn't take back the words that had left her mouth. Rob remained calm, unfazed by her stammering apologies. He had heard enough. It's too late for excuses, he said simply. You've already shown me who you really are. And I'm not going to tolerate this kind of behavior in my company. The surrounding customers exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had witnessed a moment of uncomfortable clarity, where the truth about Lucy's character had been exposed for all to see. Rob's words were like a beacon of light in a dark room, and Lucy, trapped in her own embarrassment, felt the walls closing in on her. The realization that she had just lost everything, her job, her dignity, and the respect of those around her, was the hardest pill to swallow. As Rob calmly looked at her, the weight of the moment pressed down on Lucy's chest. She had pushed the limits too far, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. Rob didn't flinch as he reached for his phone. His fingers dialed the HR department without hesitation, the call immediately going through. His voice was firm, each word clear and deliberate as he recounted the events that had transpired. The conversation was brief, yet it held the weight of a decision that would change Lucy's life forever. As he hung up the phone, he turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Your actions today have cost you your job," Rob stated plainly, his voice cold with finality. There was no room for negotiation, no leniency for the discrimination she had shown. "You're fired, effective immediately." The words hit Lucy like a physical blow. Her body stiffened, and her knees buckled slightly, as if the very foundation beneath her had been yanked away. She had heard stories about employees being fired on the spot, but she never thought it would happen to her. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her position that she had never imagined a day when someone would stand up to her, let alone the CEO of the company. But now, in this moment, she realized that all her confidence had been nothing but arrogance, and it had cost her everything. Lucy's mouth went dry, and she stammered, trying to form words that could change the outcome. "Wait, please. I didn't mean," she could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath short and uneven as she scrambled for an excuse, any excuse that might save her from this fate. But Rob wasn't having it. "There's no excuse for what you did," Rob replied, his voice steady but firm. "You made a decision to treat someone based on assumptions and bias, and now you have to face the consequences." Lucy opened her mouth again, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew that pleading wouldn't help. The decision had been made. Rob had seen enough, and she had already revealed who she truly was. The truth was undeniable, and in that moment, her pride, her defense mechanisms, and her sense of entitlement all crumbled. Her shoulders slumped in defeat as she gathered her personal belongings. The uniform she once wore with a sense of superiority now felt like an uncomfortable weight. As she picked up her things and made her way toward the door, her legs felt like lead. Her thoughts swirled in a fog of confusion and regret. How had it come to this? How had she misjudged a simple situation so horribly? Her head hung low, the shame of her actions pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty aisles as she walked toward the exit. The murmurs of the other customers had long since stopped, but their judgment lingered in the air, thick and unspoken. Lucy had made herself an outsider in a place that had once been familiar to her, and now she was being shown the door. There was no applause, no sympathy, just the cold reality of her failure. As she stepped out of the store, the weight of her mistakes hit her fully. The crisp morning air felt colder than usual, biting at her exposed skin. Rob's disappointed gaze had left an indelible mark, one that she knew would haunt her for a long time. Her pride, her arrogance, and her unchecked prejudices had cost her a job, and possibly much more. Back inside, Rob watched her go with a quiet sense of disappointment. He had always hoped that the employees he hired would understand the values he had worked so hard to instill in his company. He had believed that people could change, that with guidance and time, anyone could come to appreciate the importance of inclusivity and respect. But Lucy's actions had shown him otherwise. She had proven herself unwilling to learn, unwilling to accept the kind of responsibility that came with being part of a team, part of a larger community. He sighed, rubbing his temples. It was a painful lesson, not just for Lucy, but for him as well. He had built his business with the idea that people should be treated fairly and with dignity, but Lucy's behavior reminded him how fragile those values could be in the face of deep-rooted prejudice. Rob had hoped he could make a difference with the company's culture, but it seemed that for some people, change was impossible. Still, he had made the right decision. He couldn't allow someone like Lucy to continue infecting the environment he had worked so hard to create. It wasn't just about one person's behavior, it was about the message that her actions sent to every other employee, every other customer who walked through those doors. Rob understood that leadership wasn't just about making profits or maintaining operations, it was about setting the example for how people should treat one another. Lucy's behavior had to be addressed, and Rob had done just that. The days that followed Lucy's dismissal were a blur of harsh reality. Her world had turned upside down in the span of a few hours, and now she was left to deal with the consequences. Without her job, her income quickly dwindled. She had always lived paycheck to paycheck, believing that her position at the store was secure, that it would be enough to keep her comfortable. But now, with nothing but a few dollars in her bank account and no job to return to, she found herself staring down a future she hadn't prepared for. Her savings, which she had once thought would last her for months, evaporated quickly. She couldn't find another job, at least not one that paid well enough to support herself. The pride she once carried with her now felt like a weight that dragged her down. Everywhere she went, she saw people she had once looked down upon, people who seemed to glide through life with an ease that she now envied. Their pitying glances stung more than any insult ever could. Lucy was forced to live out of her car, a far cry from the comfortable life she had once known. The feeling of being reduced to nothing was a harsh awakening. She had never imagined that she, the woman who had always felt superior to others, would one day be in such a desperate position. The streets, once a place she'd observed from the safety of her privileged life, now felt like an overwhelming reminder of how far she had fallen. As the days passed, Lucy tried to avoid the faces of the people who had once been part of her life. She felt their judgment, their silent criticism, and it only made her shame deeper. The arrogance that had once defined her was now replaced with a profound sense of regret. She had pushed people away, thinking she was better than them, and now, it was clear that she had lost everything. In the solitude of her car, Lucy began to reflect on her past actions. It was difficult for her to admit, but the realization slowly crept in: her prejudice, her discriminatory behavior, had not only cost her a job, it had stripped her of her dignity and self-respect. She had allowed herself to become blinded by her own biases, and in the process, she had alienated herself from the world. It was a bitter lesson, one she knew she could never take back. She had paid the price for her ignorance, and the cost had been steep. But as painful as it was, Lucy couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The lesson, though learned too late, had been learned nonetheless: no one is superior to another. And now, with nothing left but the cold reality of her situation, Lucy could only hope that one day, she might rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. Meanwhile, Rob continued to run his grocery chain, focusing on the values that had always been at the heart of his business: respect, fairness, and inclusivity.